Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1137 shakes up everything we know about Shanks, Loki, ancient giants, and potentially even Kaido, as we get a ton of new reveals and new information to consider. There's even some things that may have flown under your radar, so let's get right into breaking it all down. We start things off with our 23rd entry into Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story as Yamato and Tama begin their exploration of the mysterious hideout from the last chapter. While we don't really make it past the entrance here, we are met with three men in some familiar clothing. Given these shoulder pads and fur capes, we can deduce that these are some of the remaining members of the Animal Kingdom pirates. Interestingly, they look to have traded in most of the rest of their uniforms for these kimonos and sandals, but they have kept their belts. Normally, these featured some sort of skull design on the buckle, but whatever replaced it is a bit hard to make out here. From the looks of it, it seems the remaining members of Kaido's crew may have gathered together under Who's Who, since after all, he was a former pirate captain himself, and according to the Vivre cards, had the highest bounty among the Tobi Roppo. The cat ears that they're seen wearing has been seen on some of the members of his previous crew who had been integrated into Kaido's forces as a group known as Cats. The guy in the center looks to be ordering someone around, what with his assertive finger pointing and his hand on his hip, potentially Minatomo or some of the abducted soba shop workers. We see two swords among them, and while they both vaguely resemble Yasue's blade, at least from the handle, they are still fairly generic. I'm not certain that the sword thief is necessarily the same person who abducted the citizens of Wano, but we'll just have to see. Really not too much else to talk about in this one, so with all of that said, let's get into chapter 1137, introducing Shamrock. We pick back up with the Straw Hats at All Rust Castle as Roto drops a big revelation that King Harold had died 14 years ago. Now this really introduces a whole new understanding of the timeline of events. Up until this point, we had naturally assumed that Loki was punished for his crimes against the throne relatively soon after they had occurred, and with Loki mentioning how he had been chained to the Jewel Tree Atom for 6 years, it seemed as if that was around the time that he had allegedly killed King Harold. In the previous chapter, we learned that Shanks had actually caught Loki at sea 6 years ago, suggesting to us that Loki had fled just after the murder. This recontextualized some things as it meant the incident told to us by the Giant Warrior pirates about how it took all of the Elbaf warriors to stop Loki was something that had happened after Shanks brought him back. But with King Harold having died 14 years prior, this means Loki was potentially out at sea for up to 8 years before eventually facing Shanks. He was likely causing havoc all across the New World that whole time, especially if he had the abilities from the Devil Fruit passed down across the royal family, which helps to explain how he racked up such a high bounty of 2.6 billion. Being out at sea for such a long time also lends more credence to the idea that the pirate that the Shanks figure wanted to talk to the elders about was actually Loki. Now another consequence of this would mean that Loki approached Lola for her hand in marriage at some point in that 8-year period, since after all, Loki was imprisoned 6 years ago and Lola had been stuck in Thriller Bark around 5 years ago. With Lola being 26 years old in present day, any time before Harold's death would be incredibly suspect, as she would be at most 12. Hopefully, she was much closer to at least 18 at the time, which would mean around 8 years ago, though Pudding was 16 when Big Mom was willing to marry her off the Germa, albeit even though that wedding was actually a trap. So I guess that means this could have possibly been as far back as 10 years ago, which still lines up with how Pudding was depicted when she spoke to Lola just before Lola set sail. Now, this would also bring into question some of the accounts that we got from Chiffon. At the time, it seemed like this marriage was something supported by the people of Elbaf, but if Loki had already killed Harold and fled the country, then it would mean the proposal was all his doing. And this sort of makes sense considering that Chiffon said Lola had a surprise suitor one day, as if Loki just arrived out of the blue. Now, in that depiction of Loki meeting Lola, we see Loki surrounded by a group of giants. This could just be a visualization from Chiffon as she thinks it happened, as perhaps she was not there to see the initial meeting, or it could suggest that Loki had escaped to sea with a crew of other giants. This would also help reconcile why Big Mom's family would think all of the giants were enraged at the deception, and with Pudding being a factor, I guess there's also a chance that there was some memory tampering going on. But anyways, it's quite possible that the political status of Elbaf did not necessarily make it out to the rest of the world, with it being an isolated nation, and so Big Mom would have no reason to blink at the Prince of Elbaf, whom she learned of as a child during her time there, coming to propose to her daughter. Big Mom would be blinded by her ambition to acquire the military might of the giants, something she would just assume would follow if she was not aware of what happened to King Harold and his cultural movement. Loki acting on his own here also helps to explain a weird inconsistency that always existed, with the Elbaf giants somehow being okay with their prince seeking a relationship with the daughter of one of their most hated enemies. I should mention that Harold, having died 14 years ago, also allows for some of the old gum fruit theories from a few weeks prior to come back into play, albeit with some additional logic needed to make them work. When we first learned about the legendary devil fruit passed down across the Elbaf royals, it was theorized that the gum fruit could have originated from Elbaf. When we learned Loki was imprisoned for 6 years, we assumed that was when the fruit was taken from the king, and as such, the timeline wouldn't work since the red-haired pirates stole the gum fruit from Cypherpole 13 years ago. But now that we know Harold had died a year before that, the idea of him having the gum fruit is once again on the table. Although, that would require Loki to have eaten some other fruit that he thought was the royal fruit, so things get a little messy there. I don't know how much I believe in this idea at this moment, but I just wanted to bring it up as a far-fetched possibility. Now the crew realizes the castle has been broken into, or rather out of, and begins to explore. Real quick of note is that Roto has his sword sheathed on his back. We had first seen him with it back during his debut in the Grand Fleet cover story, but have not seen it since his reintroduction in the Elbaf arc. As our group ventures further into the castle, we get a whole bunch of fascinating giant lore, starting with this room full of skeletons that were left in the wake of Loki and Harold's clash. Over 100 warriors were killed, with only Jarl and Loki remaining. Now, given that it's been 14 years since the incident, it follows that the corpses have withered away, but what is incredibly suspicious to me is how Jarl survived. If Loki was able to kill that many giants, including Harold, what stopped him from finishing off Jarl? As mentioned in last week's chapter, I'm still wondering if Jarl is hiding something, perhaps even lying about what had actually happened and pinning the blame on Loki. We talked about how the sword stuck in Jarl's head is incredibly similar to the sword wielded by Harold in this portrait, and with this chapter, we can see some of the blades that were used in this battle, and they all look to share a different generic design. Could Harold have actually been the one to attack Jarl? We've also speculated that Harold may have had ties to the world government, given his beliefs being nearly identical to the values Mother Caramel espoused back during Big Mom's flashback, so perhaps some of their forces were secretly involved in this battle as well. It's possible that Harold was the true antagonist, and Jarl chose to save face for Elbaf and pin everything on Loki, who was already despised by the nation. Conversely, perhaps Jarl was the true villain. Whatever it is, there's something that doesn't quite add up here. We also get some really cool confirmation that the giants with horns actually have the blood of the ancient giants running through them. While most giants typically are shown wearing helmets with artificial horns on them, perhaps as a nod to this ancient tribe, we have actually seen a couple of giants with natural horns throughout the series, such as in Big Mom's flashback, and even more recently with some of the children at the Walrus School. As a quick refresher, we first heard of ancient giants back during the Thriller Bark arc with Ors, who was said to have run amok 500 years ago. A bit later we met Ors Jr. at Marineford, who at the time was 70 years old and was the descendant of Ors, actually being the third generation who bore the same name, as evidenced by his ship's sail. We would get hints at ancient giant research taking place on Punk Hazard, as Law explained that gigantification was something the world government had been after for centuries, and we would meet the fruits of this labor during the Wano arc with the Numbers, who were artificially produced ancient giants. Kaido was said to have bought them from Punk Hazard, and we actually saw one of these ancient giants there during Vegapunk's flashback on Egghead. What's a bit interesting is that Roto mentions there are no longer any pure-blooded ancient giants, which may suggest that Little Ors Jr. is no longer around. Last we saw him was after he helped make one last push against the Marine forces during the war. When the battle was declared over, we saw his unconscious body on the ground, but it's not clear what happened to him since. We know that during the time skip, the Payback War took place between Whitebeard's remaining pirates and the Blackbeard pirates, although Little Ors Jr. was merely an allied captain. Even if he wasn't killed at Marineford, I suppose there's still a chance that he was one of the 16 Whitebeard ally crews that Weevil had hunted down. We'll just have to see, since who knows, maybe Roto was just simply off here with his knowledge about Little Ors Jr.'s status. In any case, Harold apparently resented his ancient giant heritage since they were largely known for their lust for war, and as such, removed his own horns, something that Zoro commends as brave, rather fitting, as he was also willing to remove his own limbs alongside Brogy back during Little Garden to continue fighting. Now, this would also mean that his children, Loki and Hyrule, have ancient giant blood running through them as well. It may be the case that Loki's horns are actually real, explaining this bandage wrapped around one of them. Plus, we did see how he looked throughout the years in the previous chapter, and he was featured with horns even as a small child. While he was not depicted with them in Chiffon's recollection of Loki's meeting with Lola, as mentioned earlier, this could just be an inaccurate mental image. As for Hyrule, he clearly lacks these features, and potentially for good reason, as we learn in this chapter that he was born from Harold's relations with another woman before Harold married the current queen. It seems the speculation of Loki and Harold being half-brothers turned out to be true, as it was always peculiar that the giant warrior pirates referred to Loki as an official child. Now, Hyrule's mother was not allowed to take the title because she was an outsider from a different nation of giants. It seems she was not treated too kindly because of this, and Hyrule was even forced to live outside the royal castle, as we saw during Big Mom's Rodo's flashback. This may be our first explicit mention of a country of giants that exists aside from Elbaf, but this has been hinted as far back as the introduction of Saul, who at the time considered the giants of Elbaf to be savages. On top of that, we also have giants such as the Yeti Cool brothers, who given their features are much more clearly from a different tribe. We would learn from the V-Ray cards that Saul was from the South Blue, and that other giants such as Sanwan Wolf and Morley were from the West Blue, so it seems plausible that there are multiple other giant nations out there. Rodo also mentions that size is an additional indicator of having ancient giant blood, which may go on to explain why certain giants like Jarl and Yorl towered over the others. And of note, earlier in the arc when the Straw Hats first encountered Rodo under the guise of the Sun God, they did mention how he seemed especially big, which may suggest Rodo also has some ancient giant heritage. Now, if simply having horns and being larger in size is indicative of being a descendant of ancient giants in some form, one has to wonder if this also applies to humans. After all, humans come in all shapes and sizes in the world of One Piece, so could it be that these features are all actually caused by some sort of common ancestry? What immediately springs to mind is Kaido, who, funny enough, bears a striking resemblance to King Harold, and his assertion about the ogres or Oni. Back when he was fighting Yamato, he mentions how Yamato is the child of ogres, and within the context of the scene, this could just be interpreted as a figurative statement, as he was trying to distance Yamato from forming attachments with Kaido's enemies. However, some fans took this as a literal indication that there was some sort of ogre race in the world. With the new revelations about the ancient giant blood in this chapter, it seems a bit more plausible now that humans with ancient giant blood could be considered ogres, similar to how humans with giant blood are considered buccaneers. However, how all this works is not entirely clear just yet, as we know Colin was the product of a human and a giant, but is seemingly not considered a buccaneer. And whenever new potential races are to be considered, we must look at Big Mom's statement of the 3 races that she's missing in her country. We've known that giants were one of them and Lunarians the other, but the third one has always been a mystery as having been lost to time. When the Buccaneers were introduced, we thought they could perhaps play that role, but could she have perhaps meant ancient giants or ogres instead? There's also a chance that all of the giant-related races are treated equally, which may leave room for a mystery race that we have yet to encounter. We'll just have to see. I should also mention that features like horns were said to have just been a natural part of this world akin to buck teeth, plus not all horns that we see on humans resemble the ones from the ancient giants, so I'm not necessarily sure that this is intended to be some sort of grand unifying explanation for the presence of these features across the series, but who knows, maybe Oda had changed his mind from the time he answered the question in the SPS and decided to offer a more thorough explanation. Now, with all of this, we get some recontextualization of Hyruden's dream, as he initially declared back in Dressrosa that he wished to be the king of the giants. And really quick, I should note that his punches are compared to lightning here, which may prove to be a fun nod to him being like a Thor-like figure in relation to Loki, but that's neither here nor there. At the time, we did not put too much stock into his words, understanding it to be a loose parallel to Luffy's dream, but for Elbaf's throne instead. However, in this chapter, we learn that his goal actually goes beyond Elbaf, as he wishes to be the king of all giants and unite them under one banner. Rodo believes in his friend's dream, much like Zoro has shown with Luffy, drawing an interesting parallel between the two swordsmen. While we knew Rodo was a navigator, we see him having great skill at drawing maps ever since he was a child, which is very reminiscent of Nami, and his perverted personality could be seen as a parallel to Sanji, with his cowardice, trickery, and use of a masked persona to exude confidence being perceived as a similarity to Usopp. I'm not sure if these are all necessarily intentional, but it is very interesting how Rodo embodies so much of the East Blue Straw Hats' personalities. Also a fun touch, in that flashback we see Rodo being bullied by some children for playing with what looks to be dolls, tying back to his fascination with making live dolls out of humans in adulthood. And as a quick sidebar, in this scene of Hyruden and the new giant warrior pirate celebrating, you can make out a familiar face for the giant we saw in the previous chapter who had a wolf-like hood, but more interestingly, Goldberg's shield seems to be awake now, as it had been depicted sleeping throughout the last several chapters. Hopefully we get to confirm our suspicions on it being a homie soon. The crew comes across some injured giants as the scene cuts away and brings us back to the ones responsible, the Holy Knights. By the end of this chapter, we get the full name of Gunko's devil fruit, the Arrow Fruit, making her an arrow woman. So far, we've seen her with a variety of abilities that make use of her arrows, which she seems to be able to produce from parts of her clothing. A few chapters ago, we saw her arrows could take the form of bandages and wrap around her enemies with great force, bringing even giants down to their knees. And in the previous chapter, we saw her manipulate and control the motion of the arrow freely, and here we see just how far that can go. She seems to be able to increase the size of her body parts by turning them into arrows, enlarging them in that state, and then reforming them into something more dense. Not only that, but she can use the arrows as a platform for movement, sliding atop them to accelerate. The most interesting part of her power is that it seems that she can use the arrows to dictate her future. And while it's not entirely clear what the limits of this are, it would seem to me that she can use the arrows to ensure that her movements connect. While some may think it's a bit silly that she would be telegraphing her actions before the opponent, it should be noted that while the arrows do take position in front of them, that alone would not be enough to reveal her precise actions. In fact, Loki being able to discern her exact movements of which limb is going to attack where may even indicate that he is capable of looking briefly into the future with his observation haki. So to me, it feels like this fruit's true strength may be in making sure the user's attacks land, even if the enemy attempts to prevent them from doing so. But this is just a guess at this point, and I'd love to get a more explicit explanation at some point in the next few chapters. While so far her arrows have been portrayed as being flat, we also see in this chapter that the arrows she creates can take a more three-dimensional form, where they can then be used to pierce through her enemies, as showcased on the rest of Loki's animal friends. Here we can see the centipede snake, the Del Kong, and the terror bear all having been pinned down and defeated. Perhaps the most curious aspect of this fruit, however, is the black flames that are shown beneath Gunko's feet. It's not at all clear what this is supposed to be, whether it's something related to the arrows or if it's a different power altogether. In the previous panels, we see that the arrow created from their boots are all black on one side and white on the other, but the arrow we see here starts black and then changes colors to white after being implanted in the flames. It's all pretty confusing. This sort of black flame imagery is a bit reminiscent of the summoning method used by the elders and the two holy knights earlier in this arc, so there may be some reason to think that there's something greater going on that ties back to Emu somehow. While we do get the confirmation that Gunko has a devil fruit, could it be that this power is still being bestowed upon her, with Emu being the original source? In the previous chapter, I had said the shape of the arrow does not necessarily match what we saw back in Mary Joie, but some of the arrows we see in this chapter are much more closely aligned to that devil-like tail design, so who really knows? Also really quick, I should note that while we don't see the transponder snail that was used by Loki to communicate with Shaggy anywhere in these last two chapters, it should still be around somewhere. It'll be interesting to see if they've been listening in on this conversation and what they'll do with that info. The other big reveal in this chapter is of course the formal introduction of Figureland Shamrock. We've spoken about this possibility of a quote-unquote second Shanks for the last few weeks, and to finally get it confirmed is a bit surreal, even if all of the signs were there. While it's not confirmed if this is a Shanks twin or clone, we are told this is Garling's son. His face is nearly identical to Shanks's, but the key difference is his longer hair with this braid running down the side. He also has a very regal military outfit, not exactly the same as how Garling was dressed during God Valley, but in a very similar vein. We've spoken about the implications of a second Shanks for a while now, so I won't get too into the weeds in this video, but this does further suggest the idea that the one who spoke with the elders was not necessarily Shanks himself. Plus, given the full reveal of Shamrock's blade, which very closely resembles Shanks' griffin, we can surmise that this was the mysterious silhouetted figure from the double-page spread with all of the contenders for the One Piece. Now, a few things of note. Shamrock's Oda box here has some distinct differences from Garling's. Neither Gunko nor Shamrock have the title of Saint, unlike Garling, but we are told Shamrock is a world noble, also known as a celestial dragon. But not only that, but we learn Shamrock is the leader or commander of the Holy Knights, whereas Garling in the present day was known as the Supreme Commander. While many might assume Garling gave up his position in order to become an elder, it seems this was not necessarily the case. This may not be entirely evident with the English translations, but distinct kanji are used in the Japanese to highlight this difference. Perhaps this means Shamrock is the leader of the unit in the field, whereas Garling is in charge of them as a whole. When Shamrock says to contact Mary Joie, he could be referring to contacting Garling in particular. Now, all of that said, it is interesting that Gunko still does not have a saint title, nor does she have any indication that she is a formal world noble, unlike Shamrock. This is her second Oda box within 2 chapters, where there is no explicit indication that she's a celestial dragon, so I'm starting to wonder if she really may not have that status. She does speak in a similar fashion to the other celestial dragons we've seen across the series, and she does mention how covered it is to join the ranks of the Holy Knights, but perhaps this is all a means of overcompensating. Could it be possible that you don't need to be of world noble blood to be a Holy Knight? We first got the notion of outsiders being able to gain celestial dragon status in the last arc with York, and just now we saw how the Holy Knights were trying to recruit Loki, so maybe it's not necessarily some prerequisite for its members to have been born a celestial dragon. As mentioned in the last breakdown, Gunko's name can be translated as military child, offering a hint that she could have been taken in and raised for the sole purpose of becoming a soldier for the world nobles. Before we wrap up, I do want to call out one potential theory that's been around for a while, especially with the revelations surrounding Bonnie in the last arc. In Volume 72, Oda drew all of the supernova with their gender-bent appearances, and fans particularly noticed how Bonnie shares a vague resemblance to Shanks in this form. While it seemed hard to believe that a beloved character like Shanks would have been the one who abducted Ginny 14 years ago, the same year that King Harold died coincidentally, the introduction of another character who looks like Shanks rekindles this theory a little bit. I'm not sure if this is the path Oda will be taking, but just something to keep in the back of our minds. Now, the chapter closes with Shamrock declaring his intention to bring Elbaf onto the world government through what seems like brute force. It seems their attempt to recruit Loki was motivated by a similar desire as Big Mom, who also thought that taking Elbaf's prince would mean gaining control of the nation's might. It's not totally clear just how much they're aware of the nation's political status, or how this might interface with the ideas of Harold being a government asset, but I'm excited to see where this goes. Are we having another large clash with the world government in this arc, just after everything that went down in Egghead? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And be sure to stay tuned for my breakdown of Chapter 1138 next week. As always, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.